Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Conversation Between. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Sarah Lubarsky, and I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. For those of you who are new to the series, welcome. The Hall is dedicated to bringing you current topics of our everyday situations that are challenging us at this time. We hope that you feel like it is something that would be worth your investment. So if you find this webinar that's inspiring and helpful, we hope that you'll consider a gift to the Hall. No amount is too small. I want to thank you all again for being with us today. And now I'm going to turn over the webinar to the very capable hands of our founding president, Gina Clonan. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello to all our attendees and welcome on board. For nearly 3 decades, the Hall has worked to discover and share the stories of women. Our various educational platforms acknowledge the individual and the collective feminine voice. There's no more important time than now to talk and listen. This will be a half-hour intimate and informative chat, followed by 15 minutes of your questions, which we encourage you to submit at any time during this webinar by simply clicking the Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen. I'll try to get to as many as possible. Our goal is simple, a virtual gathering to talk about today's important issues. We hope this will be a useful source of information while offering up helpful takeaways. I am so honored today to have as our guest a lifelong champion of equal rights for women and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. She has fought tirelessly to right social inequities at every turn, challenging the status quo with courage, conviction, and a penchant for helping the disenfranchised. Please welcome Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame inductee, Anne Stanback. Thank you, Anne.
So nice to be here.
It's so great to have you. And same-sex relationships have existed since the beginning of humankind. However, the gay movement is modern. And in the United States, it's said to have begun in the 1920s with the founding of the Society for Human Rights, the first documented gay rights organization. Most people, however, recognized in earnest the movement's beginning at the Stonewall riots in '69. Can you speak to that?
You're right, Gina, that last year we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which, as you said, is seen as the beginning of the modern movement for LGBTQ rights. People probably know the story, but at the Stonewall Bar in Greenwich Village, LGBTQ people finally hit a breaking point and fought back against the police harassment and violence that had been happening for so long. For a long time afterwards, however, what got lost about Stonewall was that it was the most marginalized people in our community, the most marginalized then and the most marginalized now, transgender people of color, who were the leaders of that effort. Stonewall was definitely a watershed event. But in the same way, it's important to acknowledge that there was a women's movement before the 1960s. There was certainly a movement for LGBTQ equality and acceptance in the US before Stonewall. We don't have time for me to go through a lot of the detail, and I'm certainly not an expert in that history, but I just want to remind people that for much of the 20th century, and certainly before, being gay was seen as deviant by most in society. Gay people were considered a security risk and denied employment. Homosexuality was labeled a mental illness by the medical profession until 1973. And probably most significantly, prior to 1962, a consensual same-sex relationship was a felony in every state. It was punishable by lengthy prison sentences and hard labor, and in fact was still criminalized in some states until 2003. Let me just close by saying it's important to remember that every marginalized group has its own unique story of oppression and its own unique challenges to fight that oppression. But as LGBTQ people, having who you are be a crime, in addition to lacking almost no support from schools or faith communities or even our families for so long, made that fight for equality that much harder.
Oh, certainly. And I think we need to be reminded of how recent the struggle is and how shocking many of the stats are, even today. So before we move on to understanding identities in the movement, which speak simply to the acronym. Can you speak to gender and sexuality as they apply here? Because I think for a lot of us, this movement has evolved and it's moving so rapidly. And I still remember that National Geographic magazine that came out with the dozens and dozens of identities. For most of us, that was so novel. We had no idea of the way people feel about themselves. So give us a little background on that, if you would.
Sure. The term sex and gender, you're right, too often get used interchangeably. Very simply, sex has to do with biology, with your anatomy, your genitals, your secondary sex characteristics. Gender, on the other hand, or rather gender identity, is your deeply held sense of who you are. And then there's sexual orientation. That describes who you are physically or emotionally or romantically attracted to. So just to be clear, because this confuses many people, being transgender isn't about sexual orientation. You can be transgender and be heterosexual, or you can be transgender and be gay or lesbian or bisexual or asexual. The best description I ever heard of how to understand the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity is that sexual orientation is about who you go to bed with. Gender identity is about who you go to bed as.
That's interesting. And I just have to say that someone just said, could you please repeat the differences again? Because it's a lot to take in.
Sure. So sex is about biology, and infants get assigned a sex at birth based on their genitals. And we have come to know in the last few decades that a not insignificant number of infants have indeterminate genitalia, and we refer to those people as intersex. So sex has to do with biology. Gender or gender identity is really your brain, not your genitals, but your brain. It's who you sense yourself to be on the inside.
Okay, that is so interesting. And so then we're moving on with this conversation. People throughout the queer community have different ways of referring to themselves. And I realize that there's history around the terms used, and it's important to understand the meanings behind each letter. So can you outline the identities that construct and define the community and how they may have evolved or even expanded over time?
We talk about the alphabet for the queer community, and I will come back to the word queer, has been expanding for decades, as you say. The most common but not exhaustive grouping of letters is LGBT and most recently added Q. So that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. Some people include an I in that list for intersex, and some people include an A for asexual. And there are people who use much longer lists, but LGBTQ is what you are most often hearing today. When I was first coming out in the early 1980s, lesbian feminists were fighting hard to move beyond just gay to gay and lesbian because we felt invisible in the movement as women. Bisexual people and then transgender people eventually pushed to be recognized as well. So like most social movements, ours is one of continual expansion of who should be included and seen. But let me come back to queer. More people, myself included, and I hear you too, Gina, using that term, we've started using queer as a catch-all or an umbrella term. Although I know older people who remember that word as a slur and are uncomfortable with it. Mm-hmm. But for many younger people, queer really feels like a term of liberation. And when I was just coming out, the word dyke, that was another term we reclaimed and used with great pride. And if you've been paying close attention in the last number of years, you will also have heard newer terms used by folks who don't want to be forced into a strict binary understanding of sex and gender. Terms like gender nonconforming, you'll sometimes see that as GNC.
And is that when we use the term they?
Yes, and people also talk about that as non-binary or genderqueer. So yes, many gender non-conforming, non-binary, genderqueer people, instead of using he, him, or she, her. They will use the plural pronouns they and them. And if you feel like you're having a hard time keeping up with the terminology, do not feel bad, because I'm immersed in this stuff and I feel some days like I can't keep up. And I mess up. We all mess up, particularly around those pronouns, or if we know a transgender person who has transitioned and they've changed their name. What's most important is that we just respect what people ask to be called, both in terms of their names and their pronouns. And if you don't know someone's pronoun and you're confused, ask them. That is always appreciated.
You know, that's such good advice, because you might remember when we were growing up, you couldn't call adults by their first name. And then when my children were growing up, I invited them to ask the person what they would be comfortable with. Would you prefer to be, Mrs. Stanback, Ms. Stanback, Ms.? And I think, just to be courteous and understand that everyone has a comfort zone, and to key into that. That's simple.
Yeah, and actually sometimes you will see at conferences, particularly queer conferences or feminist conferences, even more and more now, on people's name tags, they'll have their name and they'll have their pronouns. Sometimes in people's electronic signatures, they will put, their name, their email, their phone number, and their pronouns. So there are all kinds of ways that we can signal that. Not just, it's probably not going to be confusing for most people, but if those of us where it's not a confusion, put those signals out there and put those pronouns out there, it makes it easier for non-binary, gender non-conforming people to do that.
And it just brings up, because you and I have been so engaged in the feminist movement, it brings up the importance of language, and how literature and language and owning terms, as you said about Dyke, and when vagina monologues came up, to own these terms, or queer, to turn a negative term into something positive. I think that's so much part of equality for everyone. Don't you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, now that we're in Connecticut, and we are the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame, and you're one of our illustrious inductees, let's talk about Connecticut. One of our state's names is the land of steady habits. That name doesn't imply that our state would be a leader on issues that have been as controversial as LGBTQ rights. But the reality is that we have been. Many people know of your work on Love Makes a Family and its campaign for marriage equality. But I wonder if anyone remembers that we were the second state after Massachusetts where same-sex couples won the right to marry. But marriage wasn't the only issue where Connecticut was on the cutting edge, was it?
It was not, Gina. And our state has consistently, as you say, been a leader on these issues. Although maybe it's because we're a small state, although I think it's also because we were often the second state or the third state, not the very first state. I think another reason maybe we're not as well known is that we have been a little bit more civil. We haven't had the kind of backlash that we saw in places like Vermont or California. We definitely have a lot of work still to do, but I think we can be proud of what we've accomplished over the last 30 years. And let me just give you a quick overview of some of the highlights. I mentioned sodomy laws before. We were one of the first states to repeal our sodomy laws. I think it was 1971. 30 years ago, last month, we were one of the first states to pass a hate crimes law that included sexual orientation. And then the following year, in 1991, we became the third state in the country to pass a comprehensive law that prohibited discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, not just in employment, but in areas like housing and public accommodations and credit. We were the second state in the country to add second parent adoption in 2000. In 2005, we became the second state to pass civil unions. And as you said, in 2008, same-sex couples won the right to marry, and we were the second state after Massachusetts. So what's key, if you were listening carefully there, all of those laws dealt with sexual orientation discrimination. So that's gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. where we, like the rest of the country, lagged behind was in protecting transgender people. And to be honest, I'm not sure that most of us who were lesbian and gay activists in the 80s and early 90s knew the term transgender or knew transgender people. And because of that, it took 14 years after LGBT people were included in a hate crimes law for transgender people to be added. It took 20 years after the so-called gay rights bill was passed that our legislature finally said it was illegal to discriminate against transgender people in employment and housing and credit in those areas. Happily, transgender people in Connecticut and across the country have really, come into their own, and they have organized for other rights over the past number of years. A couple of years ago, a law was passed to make it easier to change the gender markers on a birth certificate. So when a transgender person transitions, that used to be a very complicated process to change that paperwork. Not so anymore. Just actually at the beginning of this year, we added, I still can't believe this, we added a non-binary gender marker. In addition to male and female, there's now a non-binary marker on driver's licenses and state identifications. And we also, a year or two ago, passed the first law in the country to protect transgender people who are incarcerated. Just a couple more, we passed a conversion therapy bill for minors in 2017, and then last year passed the largest number of bills to protect queer people in our state's history. So we've made a lot of progress over a relatively short period of time, and we do get listed in the top tier of states in things like the HRC Equality Index. That said,
what is the HRC Equality Index, please?
So that is the Human Rights Campaign looks at every state in the country and has a list of 10, 15 different categories that they rank states. They used to give them a number, and now they sort of put them in a tier. Mm-hmm. And they also have a similar index for municipalities, so you can go and see if your town, do you have all the protections that that you should have. And they also do the same thing for corporations, looking at what are the top corporate employers that are queer friendly. So,
and are we right to understand that all of what you just outlined, which is an intense amount of legislation, refers to Connecticut? And is this a state-by-state issue?
It is a state-by-state issue. It is a state-by-state issue. Yeah.
We're in the top 10 maybe, but I presume there must be states that are 50.
There is a 50, and I think it is Alabama. That's probably not surprising. Certainly it's interesting because I think the COVID map right now looks very similar to the HRC Equality map. It's the South and the Mountain West that looks so bad in terms of protections, and there is a long way to go. And there is, we have not paid enough attention, and that's where I think most of the gaps in Connecticut are right now, is that we've focused on legal or formal equality. There's another term that we use called lived equality, and a lot of that comes about in terms of the intersections of multiple forms of discrimination, where race and immigration status and poverty and HIV status, when those get overlaid with sexual orientation and gender identity, you see a lot of other areas of need. And it's queer youth and queer people of color, particularly transgender youth and adults of color, who are much more likely to be homeless, to have food insecurity, to be unemployed or underemployed than the rest of the population. It's racism and classism in our movement and in society that has, resulted in those things. And I guess I would say that fortunately, we are all starting to pay more attention to that.
It's interesting because I also think that you talked about legal protections, but also the idea that society opens up to new ideas. And I think about that in the way that we see more of the community on television, in movies, in theater.
Yes.
That's another wonderful way to open our minds and hearts, isn't it?
It is. And I mean, even our newscasters, you know, an Anderson Cooper, Pete Williams, I mean, not just sort of the entertainer types, but the hard news people.
Right. Athletes.
We're athletes. We are everywhere, as we always said.
All right, so let's talk a little bit. So now we've crossed a lot of milestones, but we have miles to go. So as most people on this call know, the US Supreme Court handed down a landmark ruling last month that prohibits employment discrimination against individuals based on both sexual orientation and gender identity. I'd like to ask you about that decision, Anne, but before I do that, can you walk us through some of the key SCOTUS decisions that got us to this point?
Sure. And it definitely makes me feel old when I think about the big LGBTQ Supreme Court decisions, because I can remember every one of them clearly. One of the first was, some people may remember this, back in 1986, the Bowers v. Hardwick decision. It was the year after I became a lesbian activist, so it is seared into my mind. The Supreme Court upheld a Georgia sodomy law, and in essence criminalized gay people in our most intimate relationships, at a time when places like Connecticut were really beginning to organize to pass laws to protect ourselves in the workplace and other areas. The Hardwick decision was significant because it was such a stunning loss, and while it would have been better that had it gone the other way, it really galvanized activists across the country to really, it was a long time after Stonewall, but it really felt like it was sort of a new Stonewall in the sense that we were pushing harder. It was about 10 years later, 1996, when the next big case happened. That was the Romer versus Evans case out of Colorado. And this was the first case, LGBTQ related case, that would be authored by Justice Anthony Kennedy. And it revolved around an amendment to a Colorado law which banned cities that were trying to pass anti-discrimination laws to protect gay people. So this was an important case because it said that states could not single out LGBT people to take away their rights. So that's why that was a big deal. Mm-hmm. Then 7 years later, we get another huge victory, again authored by Justice Kennedy, who we miss very much. It was a case called Lawrence versus Texas, and the court ruled that sodomy laws were unconstitutional. Now, this was significant in and of itself, but it was equally significant because the court reversed itself and its ruling in the Bowers v. Hardwick case in less than 20 years. And in Supreme Court time, that is extremely fast. And I think it speaks to how quickly societal attitudes were changing. Then we get into the next big cases from the court that all revolved around the issue of marriage in one way or another. So
where are we in now? Where are we in the history? What year are we in now?
So this is, we've now moved forward from 96, fast forward to 2013. Oh. And that is the Edie Windsor case. This is the case where the court struck down the key component of the Defense of Marriage Act, known as DOMA. People may remember that President Bill Clinton had signed that into law in 1996. And it basically defined marriage as the union of one man and one woman for purposes of federal benefits. So that Windsor case was huge and sort of broke the logjam around marriage. Then 2 years later, in 2015, almost exactly 5 years ago, the court ruled that it was illegal to discriminate against same-sex marriages. And that brought marriage nationwide to the states. That case was the Obergefell versus Hodges case. There was another case a couple of years later called the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. It seems to be about marriage.
Right?
Yes, yes, yeah. So it's not really about marriage, even though it was about wedding cakes. What it was about is efforts of the religious right to chip away at the right to marry in the same way that these groups have been chipping away at women's rights to abortion and contraception. And the court did rule that against the cake maker, but in a very narrow way. So we really are, have gotten to now to this key issue of so-called religious liberty, where the fight is today. And as we saw very clearly in the two big cases from the court yesterday related to the rights of religious employers to discriminate in hiring and the case to deny contraception, that's the heat of the fight right now.
And I might add, I do remember you're a graduate of the Yale Divinity School, is that right? So these
That's
issues
right.
Must be of particular interest to you, and being so well versed in them.
Well, I think I am not a lawyer. I'm a divinity school graduate, but I think all of us who follow these, we know that there are these two competing interests, and they're never clear cut, but you've got to weigh these two liberties. And I think they weighed them incorrectly yesterday, and we'll see what happens next.
That subject for another one, all the women who will be out of Obamacare for birth control. So Anne, I think that overview, because that was a lot to follow, so forgive me if I've lost track, but I think that overview takes us to the Bostick versus Clayton County employment discrimination decision from June. Can you give us a little overview? I mean, we've all heard about it, but why is it so important?
Yeah, so the Bostick case, a man named Jerry Bostick was fired because he was gay. They consolidated another case involving a gay man who was fired, as well as a transgender woman who was fired when she announced her plans to transition. And what the court ruled was that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does protect employees against sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination, that those things are included in the definition of sex. So it's groundbreaking on a number of levels, not the least of which it was a 6-4 vote, and the majority opinion was written by the new conservative justice Neil Gorsuch. But it was also groundbreaking because until this ruling, it was legal to fire gay and transgender people from their jobs in the majority of states in this country, even though in every one of those states, same-sex couples have been able to legally marry for the past 5 years. So I think there hasn't really been an understanding about the level of discrimination that was still legal. I think perhaps in some ways what is most historic about this case, though, it's the very first time that the Supreme Court has given protections to transgender people.
Very important ruling. And although it was undeniably a huge victory, we know that more work still remains, even in terms of basic legal protections. Can you talk about what's next to ensure LGBTQ individuals in every state that they might have the same rights we enjoy here in Connecticut?
I could talk all day about this, but I'll be brief.
You don't have all day.
We can't overstate the importance of the Bostick case, but we have to remember that it just covers discrimination in the workplace. There's a bill in Congress called the Equality Act that would be comprehensive in scope and that would protect gay and transgender people, not just in employment, but also in those areas we have protections in here in Connecticut, like housing and public accommodations. The Equality Act actually passed in the House last year on a bipartisan vote, but like so many other bills, it did not get a vote in the US Senate, and it sits there to this day. So we need to pass the Equality Act. Even with those, if we were to pass the Equality Act, it's still important that those 29 unprotected states pass their own laws. So, we need to do what we can in Connecticut to help those other states. A couple of other things, President Trump has rolled back protections for transgender people in healthcare and in the military. And we need to put those protections back and strengthen them. I would never say that discrimination based on sexual orientation has gone away, but we have so much further to go in terms of protecting and affirming transgender people. So we still need to defeat those so-called bathroom bills. We need to work on stopping anti-trans violence. Right here in Connecticut, the same right-wing organizations that are working to deny women contraception are also trying to deny transgender athletes the ability to compete in high school sports. So that's something that's being worked on right now. And I've focused so much of my comments on the courts and the legislatures, but in truth, much of what we focused on at Love Makes a Family and in our early work around non-discrimination was changing hearts and minds. And we still need to do a lot of public education, particularly around transgender issues and transgender people. And we need to engage more partners, businesses, faith communities, schools, and every person has a role to play just to make things better, particularly to make them better for young people.
Exactly, for our future generations. So we're coming to our final moments of our chat, and I just wanted to remind our audience of this quote, which I thought was very important. Amnesty International states, and I quote, "All over the world, including in the United States, people face discrimination, inequality, and violence based on who they are. When people face these abuses, their ability to be safe, to work, to receive health care, get an education, start families, and pursue their goals in life are jeopardized." And in this current moment, Anne, we face two viruses in this country, the coronavirus and the virus of racism. Can you talk just a moment about how those two are impacting the LGBTQ community?
Racism hurts LGBTQ people in the same way it hurts heterosexual and cisgender people. And then you have these overlapping in multiple areas of discrimination, and it just multiplies the impact. It's just that much harder when your movement has historically discriminated against you because of your race, and your support systems, be those your church or your family, shunned you because of your sexual orientation or your gender identity. So it just is, racism is a horrible thing, and it's just that much worse when you have these multiple factors going on. In terms of COVID, we're still learning so much about the coronavirus, but one thing we do know is that communities who experience health disparities do much worse. And in the queer community, we face all kinds of health disparities, greater use of tobacco, higher rates of HIV and cancer. We're less likely to get good medical care, either because of actual discrimination or because we are afraid of discrimination or how we'll be treated. So we don't come out and we just don't go get medical care. This is particularly true for trans people and particularly true for older queer people. So there are a lot of issues at play for sure.
The final thing I'd like to ask you is about the role of straight allies. As we've seen with Black Lives Matter, it's up to those of white privilege to end racism. Black people suffer from it, but they cannot eliminate it. What role do heterosexual persons play or should play in the LGBTQ community struggles?
This is such an important question, Gina, and I appreciate you asking it. And as you say, in the same way that white people can't underestimate the power we have to dismantle racism and white supremacy, straight allies can't underestimate their role in combating homophobia and heterosexism. Some of the very concrete ways that allies can help: speak up when you hear homophobic or transphobic jokes or comments. Be open about LGBTQ people in your life. That helps so much. Become an advocate to help change laws and policies. And don't worry if you don't know every term or nuance, or you've forgotten what gender queer or non-binary means. Don't worry about that. Just speaking up and being there makes such a difference with elected officials. You can challenge and question the institutions that you're a part of the way white people are trying to do that in terms of race. So ask your favorite restaurant, why have they still not change those gendered single stall bathrooms into gender neutral bathrooms. You know, what are local businesses, what are they doing in terms of being supportive of LGBTQ people? Talk to your local library or your school about, you know, what books on the topic and what resources they have available. Spend your dollars at places that support LGBTQ people and support the nonprofit organizations that do that work. And again, as white people are trying to do in this moment, continue to educate yourself. That advice goes for me too, because lesbian barriers and concerns aren't the same as bisexual or transgender barriers and concerns. All of us can do more and learn more. And I'll just close by saying, I remember the straight allies who were in the fight with us on marriage, and we do not forget allies standing with us, and we will not continue to make the progress we need to make without you.
That's such good advice. I'd like to remind everybody that we're going to open it up to questions now. So please, you can post your question at the bottom of your screen by clicking the Q&A button. So let's start here, Anne. Here's a great question. We talked about titles earlier and the way we refer to one another and how confusing it could be and how we might navigate that territory. This person asked, do we need to update the prefix section of online forms as when you send an email to your senator? Currently, my senator gives only 3 choices: Ms., Mrs., Miss, Mr., Dr., Mr., and Mrs. What do you think about that?
Some people use MX as the gender neutral. So I mean, people are being very creative. So yes, we do need to update those.
That's
there are some things that I have a friend who has a gender nonconforming, whatever the gender neutral term for of niece and nephew, you know, the child of their sibling. We need new language, and I think this next generation is going to help us create that new language.
I think they are. And here's a great question. Remember you talked about, I think it's called the Human Rights Campaign Index that,
yes.
That tells us.
The Equality Index.
Right, Equality Index. So this woman says, I just checked my new city of Greenville, South Carolina, score of 17 versus city of Hartford score of 99.
Oh, yeah.
What can we say, right?
I think that the good news for that person is that you have a lot of work that you can help with. Greenville apparently needs, and Greenville actually is one of the better places in South Carolina, I'm afraid.
Exactly, and you should know, right?
North Carolina, I'm North Carolina.
Oh, you're North Carolina, okay, but you're the Carolinas.
Carolinas.
I don't see any more questions, but I was just thinking that in the same way that when I talk to someone about Black Lives Matter, we like to give our audience takeaways. And of course, I want to remind everyone that there will be resources on our website, that the webinar is recorded and will be available later today. But I wonder, how do we talk to children about gender and sexuality in ways that are welcoming and not too confusing? Is there any simplified version? I know that would go according to age, but I'm sure children have a lot of questions about themselves and others.
I think they do, and I think that one of the wonderful things about children is that they don't make all the distinctions that we do. They don't, you know, they aren't born with all of these gender stereotypes in their heads. And there is a real connection between, you know, sexual orientation and gender roles. And I think that just being open, you know, making sure that you give them gender neutral books and toys to play with, and like so many areas, just not freaking out. They not only pick up on the substance of your conversation, of your words, but they pick up on the tone. If you're calm and cool and collected as you talk about it, I think that will translate to them.
I think you're right. And you know, Anne, there's a lot of reasons why I admire you through the years, but I was just thinking about when you founded Love Makes a Family. I mean, you could have called it a lot of things. And what stuck in my mind was that was really what it's all about. And so much of this movement is still all about love for one another, for our choices, for who we are as individuals. And I think that's an important aspect to remember in everything that we're talking about, the civil rights issues across the United States.
Yep, I agree. And I think that the signs that we saw in 2015 at the Supreme Court Obergefell marriage ruling, love is love. And, you know, it just doesn't get any simpler than that.
It's so true. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I'd like to close by saying first, thank you, Anne, for this illuminating conversation, and remind you all again that the webinar will be available later today at cwhf.org. This series is our newest free educational program launched during the pandemic. We'd love your feedback, so look for a short survey coming your way, and please let us know what you think. And also join us for our next webinar, July 23rd, on America's Policing Crisis with Yale professor Dr. Monica Bell. Dr. Bell's area of research include law and sociology, law and inequality, policing in the criminal legal system, welfare and public benefits law, housing law and residential segregation, and race and the law. Again, thank you, and I hope we see you again on July 23rd at 12:30. And it's always a pleasure.
Same here. Thank you, Gina.
Very
really fun.
until we meet again.